Good morning. Today we begin our study of Mark, starting at Mark 11, the 27th verse. And to give you some context, we are at the place in Mark between Palm Sunday and the Passion, the execution of Jesus. And in that week, Mark puts a lot of teachings in the temple that Jesus does, and a lot of them are teachings on authority. So Jesus is both sharing how he believes and God believes that the people who have been given authority over the people of Israel, the children of God, aren't being faithful with that authority, and also maybe even more broadly, how um, uh, the reason why Jesus was ultimately executed. So part of the storytelling is answering the question, why was the Jewish Messiah not accepted by the Jewish leaders? So that's part of the answer that we're hearing today, too. So let's begin with our reading this morning. Again, they came to Jerusalem. As he was walking in the temple, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him, and they said, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them?" So right here we have Jesus returning from Bethany, where he's sleeping at outside of Jerusalem, to the temple to start this day of ministry and teaching. And the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. The chief priests are going to be the people that run the temple. The scribes are, we think of scribes as people who transcribe. Literally is what the means, taking writing from one piece of paper to another. But scribes were more than that. They were the most educated people. We could probably think of these scribes as theologians, scholars, trained rabbis. And then the elders. And elders are going to be like elders today, honestly. They're going to be the most powerful people in the temple that aren't priests. They're going to be kind of the lay leaders. Elders are going to be appointed by Herod. Chief priests are appointed by Herod. Scribes are going to be appointed by chief priests who are reporting to Herod. So all these are kind of people who represent the power structure of Israel. And Herod, of course, was a compromised leader, as we know, who not only worked with Rome, but uh, he also held on to his power in violent ways against the Jewish people. And these chief priests, scribes, and elders are working with Herod intimately in order to keep their power, and they owe their power to Herod. So when they ask Jesus, by what authority are you doing these things? These things that they mean in a small context is the tipping over of all the uh, in the cleansing of the temple, all the money changers and the doves, and throwing that divine temper tantrum we called it last week, because who told him he could do such a thing? They could also mean it in a broader text too. The healings and the miracles, and whose name are you healing people, and whose names are these miracles being done, and in whose name are you teaching these new things about how we are to understand the law and our relationship with God? Um, and finally, it's a rhetorical question. They know the answer. They have the authority. They've been given the authority. They are the chief priests. They are the top of the religious pyramid for Judaism. So what they're saying is, who died and made you king, kind of, or who gave you this kind of power, or where do you think you're coming from? That's what they're asking Jesus. And now let's hear Jesus' reply. Verse 29. And Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me. And then they argued with one another. If we say from heaven, Jesus will say, why then did you not believe him? But shall we say of human origin? And then they were afraid of the crowd, for all regarded John as truly a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we don't know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. So this is a classic trap by the chief priests, scribes, and elders into getting Jesus to say something blasphemous. If he said he's working for God, that he's doing these miracles in the name of God, uh, or that he's teaching things that are known to be against how they understand the law, then they can charge Jesus with a crime, possibly, because they're the ones who decide what's blasphemy and what's not. Because, like I said, they're the top of the religious pyramid. Um, and so rather than Jesus answering the questions directly and lying into their trap, he poses a different question to them. And the question is hard for them, and we see why it's hard. What I love about this, what I love about this is this vision of the chief priests and the elders huddling together out of earshot of Jesus to decide their answer. And you know, it goes to the heart of being truthful, right? If someone asks us a question and we have a truthful answer, it is that first answer that likely comes to our lips. But then if we have to hold back that first answer and massage it and present it in a way, spin is the word we use in politics, then we're moving a little further away from truthfulness. And if we are in the habit of lying, or if we've been caught in a lie, before we can answer a truthful answer, we have to wonder, does that truthful answer meet the lie that I've met before, that I've given before? And so all this, to me, this scenario lifts up the problems with spreading lies, with not being honest. You not only have to keep up with the lies, you also start avoiding the consequences of admitting to the lies. And that's really what they're doing. We know by history, not by scripture, not only by scripture, I should say, but by history, that King Herod, their boss, executed John the Baptist. And the reason he executed John the Baptist was because he was popular with the crowds. A totalitarian leader wants no other person to threaten them, no matter how small of a threat that might be. They often react violently, like King Herod did, and violently he killed John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist is still popular with the crowds. We have evidence from history that John the Baptist was more popular on the day Jesus was executed than Jesus was. And so these chief priests, scribes, and elders see that if they say that John the Baptist wasn't speaking for God, which might be what they sincerely believe, they know that won't be popular with the crowds, and they could cause a riot in this million-plus people that are in Jerusalem, a time where they've assured the Roman authorities they can keep control over it and there won't be any problems, and a time they don't want problems either. But so if they say what they believe, that they don't think John the Baptist was from God, they're afraid of the reactions of the crowds. If they say what we believe, that we do think John the Baptist was working with God, then they bring into question the very violent act they did of killing John the Baptist. So you could just see how I think it's just a simple good lesson for all of us. And when we start down a path of dishonesty, it's hard to leave that path. And it just leads to more bad decisions that take us further and further from God. And that's definitely what you see with these leaders. More bad decisions that take them further and further from God. So then Jesus does a teaching to tell them what he thinks about all of them. And we begin that teaching here at the beginning of chapter 12. And then he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. And then he leased it to tenants and went away to another country. And when the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him, and they beat him, and they sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. And then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, and others they killed. And he had still one other, a beloved son. So finally he sent him to them, saying, "Surely they will respect my son." But those tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. And what then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. For have you not read the scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. And when they, the chief priests, scribes, and elders, realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd. So they left him and went away. So let's start at the beginning of this parable. Parables are supposed to be common stories of incidences that the audience is going to understand and going to sympathize with. So it's going to be an experience that they have had. So this parable matches that, because most of the poor people that Jesus would have been talking to would have been tenant farmers. They wouldn't have owned their own land. There would have been a wealthy landowner that owned that. Usually that wealthy landowner was someone who lived in the village and was the most important person in the village. Sometimes it could be someone from far away. Especially if the wealthy landowner was a Roman general that was given the land as spoils of the war, and now he lives back in Rome, and meanwhile you're farming it in Palestine somewhere, which could happen too. So it is a common incident that they're going to understand. And then we look for the surprise in this. And we might, and the surprise is always where the story meaning can be found in a parable. And the prize isn't that the tenant farmers were cheating the landowner. Tenant farmers often cheated the landowner. They cheated the landowner if he was in town, and they would hold back some of the crops. If he was out of town, then they challenged his authority. They would take over the land and not give him any money, and wait for him to do something about it, which would be to send a person, like in this story, a person was sent to collect the money because he was out of town. Tenant farmers would force the hand of landowners like that, and then they would give the money when that person came forward. If the landowner died and his wife took over, it was often the case where a tenant farmer would refuse the wife property. They would just say, no, we don't honor that. You're a woman. We're not going to do that. And then it would be up to the wife to bring enough pressure on the tenant farmers to get them to turn back over the property that she rightfully owned. You got to remember, there weren't a court system and lawyers and those sorts of things at this time. So a lot of it was about power. So that's not the surprise of the story. The surprise of the story is the violence that these tenant farmers are willing to do in order to cheat the landowner, and the escalating violence that ends tragically and horrifically in the killing of the son of the landowner. That's the part that's going to get these first century peasant farmers to go, oh my goodness, that doesn't sound like anything that could happen or should happen or would happen. So that's a surprise. The second thing we want to do is, this is kind of an allegorical parables. Parables, I was always taught, you don't want to spend a lot of time on allegory, because it takes you down a lot of blind alleys. And just because something stands for something doesn't mean that the entire action of that person or of that character fits the character it stands for. So sometimes it can lead you to different teachings that aren't necessarily helpful. That being said, this is clearly an allegory in the characters. So the vineyard is a regular Old Testament reference to Israel. Israel's called a vineyard. That's to be good fruits. So the people of God, the children of God, vineyard, all that would be the same. And then he put a fence around it. The fence around it is a reference to the law. The law has always been called the fence that protects the children of God, that keeps the children of God from straying from God too far. It's the boundaries of their relationship with God. Build a watchtower. That could be a symbol for the temple, this highest place in Jerusalem that kind of looked over the rest of Israel, the people of God. So all those allegorical things may or may not be true, but the vineyard is definitely the children of God, the people of Israel. And he leased it to tenants, and the tenants in this story are going to be the chief priests, elders, and scribes. And they see themselves as tenants, as we hear at the end of the story too. That's who God says, okay, you are in charge of my people. Bring good fruit from my people. Treat those vineyards well so that the harvest will be wonderful, right? But then the tenants start thinking that they own these people, that they've been put in charge of these people, not so that they bring good harvest for God's creation, but that they bring good harvest for them. And they're no longer willing to share the harvest of these people, the good fruits that they bring, both sacrifices of wealth and sacrifices of time, both goodness towards neighbor and goodness towards the temple. So the slaves then in this story are going to be prophets. Are going to be the prophets that come and they tell Israel that Israel, you're falling short. And the Old Testament has a good number of prophets that come and bring that to the leaders of Israel, the tenants in this story. And then obviously the Son is going to be the Son of God. It's going to be Jesus. And so Jesus is predicting his own death in the midst of this. So that's all part of the story too. The surprise of the story, if we stick with that, tells us that when we start doing dishonest things, the huddling and trying to figure out how to answer this question of John the Baptist, we start moving ourselves away from God's hope. And so the surprise of this story is that when we start doing dishonest things that lead to violence and to more violence, we end up on a path that is horrific and horrible. And this is the path that the leaders of Israel on, a path that is horrific and horrible. And then he quotes a psalm, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and let all be amazed. That psalm is a rejection by the leaders of Israel of God's ways, and now there's a new stone that's coming, and that cornerstone is Jesus. Is what other gospel writers and Paul, when he calls Jesus the cornerstone, is what they're going to say. And you can't help but hear Jesus give this teaching at the temple, knowing that the people in 68 AD and 70 AD that heard this story told for the first time, that Mark was writing for, you can't help this building that's been torn down and now they're going to rebuild it and think that the temple is destroyed, and now how is that temple going to be rebuilt? So for all of Judaism, the people of God, the children of God, they're going to look at this destroyed temple and say, oh my goodness, what does faithfulness look like? And the answer is going to be, faithfulness looks like starting anew with Jesus and building that faithfulness up from there. So the surprise in this parable is the action of these tenant farmers that goes to such extreme that they even kill the son of the owner, and that the punishment that's going to come for them, the destruction that's going to come to them. And that destruction and punishment came shortly after Jesus in the 50s and the 60s, where many chief priests were executed at the hand of a populist revolution of Jewish people that were tired of being mistreated. And that punishment's going to come from the very destruction of the temple that they had dedicated their lives to holding up and maintaining, rather than dedicating their lives to drawing people into a relationship with God as they should. And at the very end of this lesson that I read, we hear a very similar ending that came after the cleansing of the temple. These chief priests, scribes, and elders respond in a sinister way. They're going to find another way to get Jesus, and they're going to wait another day. And sure enough, they will be successful, as we read later on. And the last thing I want to lead you to is that if we want to take this parable into modern sort of form, we could say that the people of God now aren't just the Jewish children of God, that in Jesus, you and I, who I assume are Gentiles and not Jewish, we have been adopted into this family of God. We are now the people of God too. So this vineyard has gotten much larger. But the tenant farmers are people like me, and maybe people like you, people who are part of the church, that are called to nurture the people of God and help them bring good fruits of worship, good fruits of service to our neighbor, uh, good fruits of generosity to God and to God's kingdom. That's the role of the church. And periodically, we have prophets that come to us and tell us that we're doing the wrong thing, that we need to change our ways. And are we listening to those prophets from God? Or are we like the chief priests and scribes, where we don't think those prophets have the right message because they go against our message? And so then are we ignoring them or even hurting them? The chief priests and scribes didn't believe John the Baptist because John the Baptist was saying they were doing the wrong things. As the church, are we not believing the prophets that speak against us because we don't want to hear what they are saying? So now that this new cornerstone has been built upon Jesus, that is the church willing to listen and to recognize God in our critics as they come forward? That'll be enough for today. God's peace in your week ahead. Please respond with questions or emails to me personally or on this website. Thank you.